Hi, my name is Dr. Stephen Stolz and I'm from the Trobe University, and today I have with me my guest here is Dr. Maurizio Toscano from the University of Melbourne. Maurice, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Steve.
Now, I've asked Maurice to come along and speak today about one of his areas of expertise, and in this case, science education. So let's get started. First question I want to ask you is, there's a fair bit of literature, if you read the print media, you listen to TV, the radio, so on. You'll hear that science is taught poorly across the board. And so obviously it leads to the question of, well, why is it so difficult to teach in science?
Well, I think science is difficult to teach because it's a difficult practice. It actually requires a lot of time and dedication. And I think one of the things about science as a practice is that you get better at it the more you do it. And I think that schools generally don't set up the kinds of situations which allow for the kinds of practices, the kinds of activities which really encourage that kind of scientific inquiry. Which means that to some extent, you could think of science education trying to induct young people into the community of scientists. I think that's one of the aims of science education. There are other aims, and I think that's one of the issues about science teaching is working out what it is that you're trying to do. But I think a large number of people who are interested in science education really want to induct people into a scientific way of thinking or a scientific way of approaching knowledge or approaching the world. Now, I think the reason why that's so difficult is because the scientific community is quite distinct. They have their own methods. There's the scientific methods, and I deliberately say methods because I think there are multiple ways of doing science. But I think what's incontrovertible is the fact that those methods are sort of agreed upon. That to become a scientist, to participate in science, is to come to know how to do science, the scientific method, agree to it, and then you have a community that says, well, we all do it this way, and if you do it this way, we can trust what it is you say, we trust the kinds of claims you're making. So that means that science is a huge enterprise that's spread across hundreds, thousands of people, but also spread across time. I mean, it's taken many generations, countless of people over hundreds of years to develop the kinds of practices and the kinds of knowledge that allows us to interrogate the world. And that means that it's incredibly difficult in a short period of time to introduce young people into that practice. Which means that often science education becomes about introducing models or proxies for that scientific engagement at one level, or simply saying, well, here are the fruits of the scientific endeavour. So there's either let's do a little practice of what science is like, so that you've got an idea of what the enterprise is about, or let me give you some interesting things that have come out from science, and therefore you either have the knowledge or the practice. But I think at a sort of deep philosophical level, there's a kind of important distinction to be made about scientific practice because it is quite unique. I think the usual view of science, what you might call the epistemological view, and here I kind of very influenced by Bruno Latour's work, sees science as a way of relating to nature, to the world out there, and the caricature of science is that scientists treat the world as being quite independent of them, that scientists go out and discover things in the world that are just sitting there, and practices are just about trying to uncover them. There's also this notion that somehow the laws of nature are already out there and they're unified in some way. The other aspect of science is that somehow science aims at de-animated truths, that somehow it's not about folk stories about why things happen. There's a kind of agency there, but rather you're looking for causal mechanisms. So it's trying to get at an objective truth. And finally, there's the aspect of science, which is that once you come to some agreement, there's a kind of the debate ends there. You know, we can agree on this, and it's indisputable. So we have a kind of fact. Now, what Latour showed through his work on the sociology of science is that, in fact, scientists don't practice that way. The scientific community are actually engaged in that what we come to think of as nature out there is actually embedded in the kinds of practices in the scientific method. So if you want to know where the Higgs boson is, it's not out there, it's in the kinds of practices and apparatus and conventions and discourse that goes around the scientific enterprise in physics. And that's where you'll also find the Higgs boson. The boson is not just in nature, but it's also in the way we interrogate that. Science also is not just directed at reducing things to some general principles or laws of nature, but in fact that every time a scientist approaches the world, it generates more and more intrigue, curiosity, and it proliferates the kinds of things that scientists have to attend to. And finally, there's this notion that in some way the training of science is not just about coming to facts, but also coming to see the world as animated in some way. And that makes it very exciting because it means that you can have a conversation with nature, because nature is always stimulating you to asking you questions, questioning your own orientation to it. It sort of objects in some way to kind of the imposition of some idea. So there's this kind of constant debate with nature and with other people. Now, that I think captures the if you like, the scientific enterprise and the scientific method. That the scientific method allows you to be intimately connected with nature and for nature to appear in a particular way, in a disciplined way. So I think another way of thinking about the scientific enterprise is that it's disciplined, constrained imagination. Now, if you characterize science in that way, you see that it is incredibly complex and incredibly rich, and asking science educators to introduce people to that is a real challenge. And so to some extent, one of the issues of science education is how much of that do you take into account?
Sure. That was actually going to be one of my questions, of course. I was going to ask 2-3 things as quickly as possible, I guess, in 2 to 3 minutes. What would be the main kind of problems, if you like, I guess, with science education or the teaching of science? What like, what would they be? I mean, I know you've alluded to it in terms of you have this very rich tradition, and then of course, I can imagine if you do not come from that tradition, as in you weren't a scientist first. That somehow you might be deprived. Well, deprived is probably not a good word, but you might not be familiar with the ongoing narratives and dialogues that take place within those traditions. Yeah. Obviously, you come from a physics background, so you're fully aware of those ongoing dialogues and dynamic nature of the narratives. So I can only assume that may be one of the problems, but then of course you have different age. Obviously, in an educational context, you have different, kind of ages. You have obviously, different parts of the curriculum that you're teaching. So I guess as soon as you start adding these layers, the complexity increases quite a fair bit. But sorry, I wanted to.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to be 3 things, maybe 1 or 2.
No.
Kind of perennial issues. How's that? Perennial issues.
Well, I think one way to put the pose the problem is to think about what the proper relationship is between science and science education, because the two are sort of heavily intertwined. Now, you might say that they're entwined at the level of sort of practice and methods. So if you're doing science education and research, you want to draw on, you can often make the assumption or presuppose that you can treat education in a scientific way, that you can apply the scientific method to try and figure out whether there are causal relationships between certain types of practice. That's one way of looking at it. The other way is a kind of thinking about education as a kind of apprenticeship in particular practices. In which case, that if you set up the right sort of laboratory exercises, that you're demonstrating good practice. And I think that's often associated, I think nowadays, with a very didactic approach. That it's all about activity without much thinking. And then I think finally there's an issue about the aesthetics of science. And perhaps I think that's one place that science education needs to think more about, especially in a philosophical way. And that's to say that perhaps what educators of science are doing, are engaging in an aesthetic practice, a process, where they're making aesthetic judgments. That when a teacher is saying, "Oh, well done, that was really good," in response to the way a student thinks about science or their understanding and appreciation of science, what they're really doing is making a kind of claim to the aesthetic quality of that experience. Now, it's not to say that scientists are not concerned with aesthetic judgment, but I think that what's underrepresented in science education is just how important that aesthetic judgment is.
Sure.
So let me illustrate it this way. You might think of there being two types of kind of judgments, and Immanuel Kant spoke about this too, wrote about this. That one is a kind of judgment where you express an opinion about something that you like, but you don't for a moment expect that to have some universal appeal. That when you say you're just sort of simply expressing something about something that's agreeable, in his words. And so I know that it's a subjective evaluation of something, but I don't expect everyone to hold on to that. But there are certain things, certain subjective claims that we make about the beauty of something, for example, that we say, well, no, in this case, what I want to do is I want to operate on the assumption that there's something so valuable about this that it really should have universal appeal. And that I've come to some understanding through my own experience that this is something more than just something that's agreeable to me. That there's something about it which is universally useful or appropriate for others to have. And therefore I will say, well, I'm judging this to be beautiful or truthful or something significant. And then that kind of aesthetic claim is then an invitation to people to say, well, yeah, look, I agree with you. I think that you're quite right, and I trust your own experience that you can and wisdom that you can sort of make such a claim, and therefore I accept it. And then what happens, of course, is if you agree to someone's judgment in that way, then you kind of set up an aesthetic community. So in lots of ways you might think of science education as having more to do with art history or art appreciation than it does to do with the scientific method. Because a science teacher's role, is to make such claims to universal applicability or universal appeal, so that it gathers people to say this is valuable. Now, you might see that the perennial issue of student engagement, the dilemma of students leaving the sciences, being disengaged and therefore not participating in science and taking up science careers, is really being about a failure of the aesthetic judgments that teachers are making. So I think if science teachers attended more to the degree to which they instantiated those values of judgment, those aesthetic claims, then they'd be in a much better position to know whether the kinds of claims they're making are the kinds that will gather people together in a kind of community of appreciation, or whether they're just kind of, it's just taken as a personal opinion, I can take it or leave it. Now, I think one of the big issues with science education is that in the past, I think a lot of the setting up of that aesthetic judgment about science being valuable in a kind of universal way was already done by culture and by society. And I think what's happening now is because we're sort of valuing much more the immediate gratification of the individual, those kinds of big ideas sort of fallen by the wayside. In a sense, the rejection of the meta-narrative has destroyed our capacity to make these aesthetic judgments. That's not to say aesthetics are no longer in play, but the aesthetics of science are no longer supported by society. Fortunately, though, I think they're supported by the scientists. So the scientists who are not necessarily in the business of aesthetics are nonetheless producing ways of encountering the world in an imaginative way, which present an aesthetic picture which is appealing, which is why people are very interested in David Attenborough's work, Brian Cox's stuff, all these fabulous communicators of science touch on the grand narrative of science, the kind of that aesthetic quality. And then science educators wonder why it is that they're so successful, and then in the classroom somehow it fails. And maybe, I'd suggest, that science teachers don't love science enough to come across as being as making judgments about the beauty of science or the value of science. And this isn't a move which is, and I'm not suggesting that this is some fancy power game in order to collude people, but rather a very human tendency to try and draw a community and test that out in that community.
Sure. We might leave that question there and we'll move on, but I guess there's a nice connection to the next question. And this one I think is gaining a little bit of momentum in different spaces. But the obvious question is, look, why does contemporary society privilege science? I've got the example of STEM here, particularly over other curriculum areas. I mean, you tune in and you see that the federal budget, they're allocating money, obviously, to get different parts of the demographic of Australia into science, and obviously there's a fair bit of money heading towards this space around STEM. And so I think it's a legitimate question to ask. Yeah. And I'm interested in your thoughts on this.
Well, I think that the issue has a really long history, and that's that science. I mean, one way to think about it is that science has proved its worth. It's proved a valuable way of dealing with the world in such a way where what gets proliferated are ways of solving problems and creating new ways of being, if I want to use that existential term. So science is incredibly successful, even from an economic point of view. And I think that's gone hand in hand with, people are very suspicious of the idea of civilization, but it's gone hand in hand with the idea that human beings are now have accessible to them a much greater repertoire of ways of being, either through technology or and through science, health sciences, for example. I mean, we just live longer, and so we see in a kind of tangible, embodied way the result of science. Now, if you then look at that from a lens of a sort of capitalist lens or from an economic lens, and you say, well, that's very good. Science it seems to be a kind of an enterprise which allows for innovation and allows for improvements. So built into it is a kind of feedback mechanism where you have an innovation that allows you to access more resources, intellectual resources. You can use those to then buttress, further exploration. And so it's a kind of it promises this kind of exponential growth in access to the world, and of course, exponential growth appeals to anyone who's hell bent on this idea of progress. So I think the story of science and the story of progress, as measured via the proxy of economic growth, just means that it is the language, if you like, of power. It's the language of growth, of potential, of exploration, Now, you can have all sorts of critiques of that. You can have a Marxist critique of that. You can have a postmodern critique of that.
Yeah.
But I think in a very in a sort of broad brush sense, there's undeniably a strong correlation between science and this idea of moving up in the world. It's interesting to note that, for example, in highly developed countries, the population of young people are less interested in science than those in developing countries. And I think it's because people in developing countries see science as the mechanism for progress.
Sure.
And so that means that one would want to give some sort of privilege to any area which has a track record in delivering what it is you want. Now that means, of course, that if you change the rules and change the values, then science might have a different place. But I think that's what it is. So in terms of social mobility, economic growth, it's not surprising that the STEM disciplines have this kind of allure. But going back to what I said earlier, the other thing which is very tempting about science is that if you view science as giving you access to this universal, indisputable, objective reality, this metaphysical space called nature, the universe, the observer-independent world. It's from a metaphysical point of view, it's very, very appealing. So I think the power of science is that it has this metaphysical allure and this economic one.
For some people, I can imagine they would be attracted to notions of certainty with these systems.
Yeah.
But if anyone who knows anything about science knows that they're actually not certain at all.
No. In fact, the uncertainty is built into it. I mean,
Yes,
I know that you're familiar with Popper's work. I mean, the idea is that you're not there to set up these truths which are kind of going to stand, for 1,000 years. But what you're trying to do is set up the conditions for things to fail. Because I guess
you're doing your goddamned hardest to try and kind of fail or test whatever it is that is claimed to be the truth.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes science really difficult, is that it requires a huge amount of humility. So I think that perhaps it's a disservice to science and science education to continue this idea that the purpose of science education is to get students to encounter how exciting and wonderful science is, rather than saying, actually, science is a kind of a systemized exercise in tragedy and kind of disruption, and it's a real painful process. And the only thing that saves you from going mad in that process is a dedication to the process itself, is a dedication to saying, I could be wrong, and I need to test it out against the world and other people. And if everyone does that, to some extent, science has resolved, the scientific community has resolved a political problem, is how you get people to agree to a particular method which is not its own dictatorship, that one voluntarily submits to the scientific method, not because it promises truth and certainty, but the opposite, because it promises a dedication to humility, to kind of testing yourself out against the world and other people.
Yes.
So it's a safeguard against certainty. It's a safeguard against arrogance, and quite frankly, it's it's the same problem in philosophy. There are not very many people who can genuinely subscribe or dedicate themselves to a discipline that asks that of them. So I think that's So I think perhaps in some ways STEM should be more admired, but for reasons other than just the economic or the metaphysical underpinnings of it. Yeah.
Of course. All right, now I'm looking at the time. We've got about 5 minutes. We've gone a little bit over, but that's okay. Next question is, look, if you had a crystal ball and you could gaze into it and look into the future, what do you think science education would look like in the future?
that's a really good question. I'm not very optimistic about science education in the future, partly because I think that that science itself is on a particular trajectory that is being completely ignored by the science education community and anyone who really takes science seriously. I think that science is associated with progress and this notion of an exponential expansion in encountering the world. But that's come about because of a peculiar circumstance in sort of late modernity, which is really just access to kind of energy. I mean, that's the scientific enterprise, if anything, is a manifestation of being able to get access to energy. And that energy has been translated into specialization and complexity. Specialization and complexity leads to kinds of efficiencies, which means that you can get growth, right? Now, the question is, well, what happens when that energy runs out? Or what happens when you get to a point where the level of complexity starts to become detrimental, where the scientific enterprise becomes so big and so convoluted and so complex that that it no longer delivers more than you put into it. So I think that science is fast approaching a level of complexity, a level of super and hyper specialization that there are going to be diminishing returns. And that means that although it's not a threat to the principles of science, to the scientific method, although it's not a threat to how scientists gather themselves or identify themselves, I think it is going to be a threat to the enterprise as just an economic venture, if you like. And that means that science education needs to start thinking now about what science will be like in the future, when coupled with the disinterest in science because of coupled with the disinterest in science because the aesthetic of science is not sufficiently conveyed through science education, plus the fact that science is not going to be as productive as it was in the past, those two factors taken together is going to require a different approach to science education. And my feeling is that that the aesthetic dimension of it will be much more useful than an economic justification, which means that I think if all goes well, we'll no longer be talking about promoting science to young people and promoting STEM fields because they're really good for the economy, but because doing science creates a kind of sort of cultural beauty, which is enduring.
Look, I was just looking at the time there. Look, we might leave it there. Look, I could keep going. We could talk for probably another 30 plus minutes, or if not more, but we might leave it there. Thank you for coming in. I appreciate it. Thanks for accepting my invitation, and thanks for